Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat sermon with Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
A short conversation I had with a colleague last Friday night ended up linking Africa to America, Uganda to Minnesota and Los Angeles. I was in the home of my friend and colleague, Rabbi Gershom Sizomu, the Ugandan-born, Ziegler-trained rabbi of the Abba Yudaya Jewish community. By that time, I had been traveling for nearly 2 weeks, and in some ways, both blessedly and cursedly, I had been without reliable internet access. I had only episodic bursts of headlines about the events in our country. The last 2 weeks have been hard in America. A coarsening and a worsening of events and discourse that had been sliding for some time. Few Americans that I know are sanguine about recent developments. People may be unhappy and disappointed or angry for wildly different reasons, but no one seems to be outright applauding this current stasis. Immigration and border policy have been part of the American political conversation for decades, probably centuries. There's nothing close to unanimity in this country regarding an approach and a solution that seem both sane and compassionate, that both live up to Emma Lazarus's words emblazoned on the Statue of Liberty, beckoning to our shores the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and which also creates a secure, coherent border, one befitting an independent modern nation, and which rewards and incentivizes those who seek shelter within our border via legal means. This is a morass, and I sadly have no hope that even in my lifetime, Americans can come together on this. I have felt this for some time, but recently things have gotten worse. And for most of 2 weeks, I was somewhat blissfully detached, able to focus on myself and my spirit and the logistics of a complicated trip and the powerful exposure to sub-Saharan African Judaism, not to mention the breathtaking wildlife that we were experiencing as a group. I knew my fellow Americans were convulsing. I knew that the streets of Minnesota were filled with violence and protest and counter-protest and fear and recrimination and raids and bloodshed. I knew my son-in-law-to-be felt uneasy traveling from his dorm to his medical school classes. I knew my Machatanim-to-be in the Twin Cities were part of an underground effort to bring food and necessities to immigrants afraid to leave their homes. I knew my colleagues were writing, dispatching, representing, and arguing, and I knew all this would be waiting for me when I returned. And then I found myself speaking privately with Rabbi Sizomu at Shabbat dinner in his home. He mentioned to me that his eldest, who spent some years in L.A. as a young child while Rabbi Sizomu was studying here, had returned to L.A., at least partially to escape a culture of young men his age in Uganda succumbing to an excessive alcohol consumption. His son had some challenges while back in our fair city, but he has righted his ship. He is on a wonderful path. He is gainfully employed, and he is terrified. Why? Because he has overstayed his visa, and his skin is black, and ice seems to be everywhere. He knows he has violated national immigration policy, and he also fears for the quality of his life if he goes back to the hills of squalor in southeast Uganda. He is here unlawfully. Is he a criminal? Some of you may think you have an easy answer to that question. I do not. I do think we need a coherent policy. I don't think law should be governed on an entirely case-by-case basis. And I don't think the United States is safer or better or a more defensible polity if the good son of a good man and rabbi is deported back to Uganda. I don't think we are better if this young man is living in fear. So I was in Mbale at that moment, talking to Rabbi Gershom, and I was in LA in that moment, and I was in Minnesota, right in the middle of it. Before I go deeper on this subject, here are my usual caveats, some of which you are used to if you know my general style and approach to wielding the bima. I am a rabbi, and I'm neither a legal nor political scholar. If I have any expertise, it is in our revered, inherited tradition and the interweaving of law and ethics that emerged from the Torah and the literature that flowed from it. I don't tell people how to vote from this bima ever. As long as I am here, Temple Beth Am will continue to be a safe and a welcoming and an intentionally purple place with no litmus tests for political affiliation. Nearly every time I open my mouth to speak, I'm intending to illuminate something from within our tradition. And I mostly leave it to you, to those listening, to determine when and how to apply it to your lives and to our political lives. The Torah was and continues to be a very political document. It was given to us in order to help refine actual society and build towards goodness and order and beauty. And the Torah and its successors do not weigh in on one and only one way to be American. The Torah says nothing about democracy, could not even conceive of it. Its verses and its interpretations can be fairly wielded to support mutually contradictory assessments of our society and the policies towards fixing it. The headlines are horrific. The discourse, I find, is predictable and thus boring and sorely disappointing. I'll give you just one example. The killing of Alex Jeffrey Pretty. I'd like to think all consider it tragic. The footage of his last moments have now been studied closer than the Zapruder film. New experts are born every minute who seem to have 100% clarity about what happened, about what they would have done had they been any person in that scene, and about how a terrible situation unfolding in real time can be easily judged retroactively with a frame-by-frame analysis. You know what I wish? Other than that he were still alive? I wish I had read the analysis of one person who is generally in favor of ICE's work in our country and cities, who leaned Republican red, who voted for Trump, who decried previous administrations' lax border policies, who thought that anti-ICE protests were themselves violent, unlawful, and obstructing justice, and yet who sized up this situation as an unconscionable lack of restraint and de-escalation, and who faulted ICE in general and the shooter, in this case, for Pretty's death. I wish I had found one such person. And I wish I had found one person or pundit or colleague who thinks that Trump's unleashing of ICE in this manner is unjustifiable and borderline fascist, and who is convinced that our current border policy is fraught with racism, and who proudly protests against ICE and puts themselves on the line to protect generally law-abiding and nonviolent immigrants and even those who are here unlawfully, but who in this case believed that Pretty took his life into his hands when he brought a gun to a protest and did not yield to the direct commands of officers of the law, and that as such he's responsible, if not more, for his tragic death than is the man who shot him. I wish I'd found one such person. But such people have been elusive in my mind, non-existent. We retreat to our corners. We live through confirmation bias. We rarely say or think something truly surprising. And we are convinced that everyone else is utterly and irredeemably wrong. What a country. What a society. And still my heart is heavy. Because even with what I wrote above, we should be confident to believe what our eyes perceive. And while it is true that the head of ICE today is the same as it was under President Biden, and while it is true that in 5 years of the Trump presidency there have been less than 3 million deportations, while under Biden there were more than 4.5 million, under Obama there were more than 5 million, and under Bush #2 there were more than 10 million, it's also true, I believe, that officers of the law seem to be engaged in human rights violations, and our country just does not look and seem familiar to so many. In the last few days, a mother, a United States citizen, was shot and then denied access to medical care. She ultimately died. Video footage made clear that the ICE account of the incident was patently false. In the days since, 6 federal prosecutors have resigned after pressure to pursue action against her widow. A black family, again U.S. citizens, attempting to return home while following agents' directions, was hit with flashbangs and tear gas. Their 6-month-old baby aspirated and required CPR. ICE initially blamed the parents, calling them agitators who endangered their children. But they had to retract that statement when it became clear the family was merely attempting to return home. A United States citizen originally from Laos was dragged from his home in his underwear into freezing temperatures, denied the opportunity to verify his identity, and was taken away by agents. There have been multiple instances of parents being taken into custody while very young children were left alone at the scene. There are other incidents of young children being held by ICE essentially as bait for their parents. Is this the only way? It is true that some who are protesting are violent and are obstructing and are engaging in civil disobedience that borders on the uncivil and are making some very poor decisions that jeopardize their own lives. And I think it's also true that too many officers of the law who have more powerful guns seem more prone to and more trained for escalation than restraint. Is this the only way? And my timeless question from the Bima is always this: what does the Torah tell us about this? What illumination can we find from our most sacred source? We read this morning Shirat Hayam, the Song by the Sea. Actually, Zoe read it, chanted it beautifully and expertly. The imagery is striking. Moshe's exultant poem to and about God, representing the aches and yearnings of a people liberated, makes it clear that there is no freedom without some power, some force. Regarding the violence at the Sea of Reeds, the Hasidic master Shalom Shachna taught, that which results in the good cannot take place without opposition. Now, both sides of today's American political debate can wear that quote, that idea, as a mantle. Society's order cannot be maintained without rules, whose enforcement can be violent. And resistance to perceived oppression cannot be effective without concomitant violence. I'm struck by the words in the 3rd verse of the song, Adonai ish milchama, Adonai shemo. God is a man of war. God is his name. At face value, the verse venerates war as divine, required, part of the unfolding pathway to freedom and order. And I hear these words singing to us across the millennia. Society and civilization need rules and might. We pray to a muscular God, and we live in a world where at times force is needed to maintain order. God was an ish milchama, a man of war in the very process to liberate us from Egypt. And God remains exacting and severe and precise in expectation of us, God's children. A wrong step can be perilous. At the same time, the name of God used in that verse wonderfully complicates things. The name of the God in that verse is the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, which by tradition is unpronounceable, but we articulate as Adonai. It is the name of God associated with kindness, with softness, with chesed, with compassion. It's an incredible and fetching oxymoron for the Torah to say that Adonai, the God of warmth, is an ish milchama, a man of war. It's maybe even more interesting to read the analogy in the opposite direction. That ish milchama, that divine warrior you are grateful to and obedient to and seek to emulate, even that God is Adonai, bespeaking a love and a grace that must temper the instinct to exert force. Where is Adonai ish milchama on the streets of Minneapolis? Where is there too much milchama, warlike violence, and insufficient representations of Adonai, the softest and most forgiving divine aspect? When I was at JTS in rabbinical school, I had the near daily blessing of davening in the morning a few feet away from my beloved Talmud teacher, Rabbi Israel Frankus, of blessed memory. Rabbi Frankus was a force. He was short and diminutive in stature, but his mind and his wit were outsized. He was raised in Poland. He survived Auschwitz, and he taught Talmud at JTS for 50 years. You know how some people say certain lines of liturgy in their prayers somewhat out loud, even if they're not leading? I have my own that somehow just emerge in an audible lilt when I get to that page. Rabbi Frankus had two that he always said in a sweet sing-song. One was from Psalm 30. It would be quiet in the room, and then you would hear him say in his voice, Ani amarti beshalvi, balamot leolam, which means, I said and I was secure when things were peaceful, that I would never stumble. I never asked him, but it seemed to me that the verse for him was a cautionary tale against smugness, against assuming that contemporary equilibrium was secure and would persist. No discerning Jew should ever fall into that trap. And the other verse was from Psalm 146. It would be quiet in the room, and he would say to the same tune, Al tiftachu b'nadivim, bevein adam she'en lo tshua. Do not put your trust in high and mighty noblemen, in those who have no power of deliverance. Again, I never asked him. But in my interpretation, Rabbi Frankus' life story had led him to the conviction that humans will disappoint, that those who promise salvation cannot really offer it. The only true salvation comes from God. Humans are frauds, poor and flawed imitations of the divine. Do not trust them. Certainly do not trust them completely. We are all too base, too limited, too egotistical, too earthly to be the source of adoration and adulation. Such reverence is only for the Holy One. I think of Rabbi Frankus and my interpretation of those vocalizations in his prayer when I think of how the great liturgists crafted our prayers. As I said before, we recite Shirat Hayam, the Song by the Sea, every day in prayer. But in liturgy, the poem is framed very differently than in the Torah itself. In the Torah, the song yields to a narrative, the rest of the story. The Israelites reach dry land, Moshe leads them forward, you know how it goes. But in the Siddur, the song has a coda. 3 verses from 3 other places in the Bible, as if to tell the worshiper to read and consider that song through the prism of these 3 verses. The verse is from Psalm 22. Ki l'Adonai hamlucha. to God, and God only is their kingship. The second verse is from the prophet Obadiah. V'haita l'Adonai amlucha, and dominion and rule shall be God's and God's alone. Sense a theme? And the third is from the prophet Zechariah, chapter 14, words you all know from the end of the Aleinu. V'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yiyeh Adonai echad ushmo echad. God will be ruler over all the land. On that day, God will be one, and God's name will be one. The message seems clear to me. The Israelites may have followed Moshe into the split sea. Nachshon, according to the Midrash, may have shown the courage to push God to act. Miriam may have played and sung a beautiful tune. They are all admirable people and leaders. But ultimately, kingship belongs only to God. Anyone who arrogates to himself or herself regal authority is violating something significant about the Jewish conception of the world. Even biblically, the rules about appointing a king seem to be a concession, a nod to what the people thought they wanted and needed, but they didn't. Ideally, no person ought to be that revered. Only God. No leader's rules and policies ought to be followed uncritically, unflinchingly, assuming that the rules are proper and perfect. Only perhaps God's, and even God's rules we sometimes bicker with. The end of the beginning of our liberation from slavery was framed and remembered by our ancestors with a warning to trust and slavishly follow no person, no human. The song itself valorizes war and force when needed, but also centers the God of compassion and leniency. Our country needs to imbibe, internalize, and live by those sentiments. More, much more than we are currently experiencing. In the words of my dear friend and colleague, Rabbi David Ingber, when force is used to dehumanize, it isn't governance. It isn't enforcement. It is sacrilege. Being an evolved society cannot just mean that whoever holds the biggest guns are just and thus should be unquestioningly obeyed. It cannot mean that whoever happens to be elected is presumed to be right. It cannot mean that enforcement is always more important than restraint, or that restraint is always more worthy than enforcement. We can do better. We must do better, and soon. I miss spending Shabbat with Rabbi Suzomu in Uganda. I pray for his son. I hope he's okay and safe and free of fear.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tbala.org.